Quitting a job after 16 years in the middle of a pandemic, I hope to be able to tell that story as a success story one day.
Hello, this is Abhilash Jaykumar, co-founder and managing director of Trust Vista. On today's Trust Vista talk, I have the pleasure of being joined by Gerson Guzman, co-founder of Ceiba Capital. Gerson, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Now, Gerson, you and I have known each other for a number of years in your previous career at Corinthian and more recently as a entrepreneur yourself, launching your own firm. But maybe we can start this conversation by going way back to the beginning of your story, because you have a very atypical story of how you've come into private equity and how you've grown your career. You were born and brought up in Guatemala before coming to the US for studies. Can you maybe talk about how coming from that background has shaped you?
Yeah, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk about my journey, as I like to call it. So yeah, I was born in Guatemala. I moved to the US when I was 7 years old. My parents immigrated here due to the political situation in the 80s in Guatemala. So I am kind of true to my roots. In fact, the name of our firm, Ceiba Capital Partners, is a bit of a hat tip to that. Ceiba is a holy tree within Mesoamerican culture, but it's also the national tree of Guatemala. So it just felt like pun intended here, a great way to reflect my roots by using that as the name of the firm. I also felt that the Greek and Roman pantheon had been fully plundered and no more gods were available. So I needed to look south for this one. But to answer your question more directly, yeah, I came into private equity in a very non-traditional way. I actually started my career at SBC Communications in the network operations group. So that was straight out of college, mid-90s. It was the Wild Wild West in the telecom sector, pretty exciting sector to be in. There was also the .com frenzy that was taking place at the time, and it was an exciting time to be in telecom. But I ultimately realized that I couldn't work at a large corporate entity, as exciting as the industry was. So I lateraled from there to a firm that's now known as Oliver Wyman. Previously, it was Mercer Management Consulting, where I provided strategy consulting services to a number of big Global 500 clients. Did a lot of work in Latin America, actually. Spent some significant amount of time in Mexico City to be specific. And then left the glory days of consulting to go back to business school. Did my MBA and an MA at the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School and the Lauder Institute. And use that time to lateral into the industry. Was not easy because most people were looking for kind of the traditional PE background, which I describe as a couple years of investment banking, a couple years of principal investing. But I really sort of figured out a way to leverage my skill set working with operating companies to pitch myself as someone that could come in and do more than just run models. And that's basically how I got into the industry.
Yeah, and starting your career in the late 90s in telecom is interesting because most people, if your history of Wall Street, think about the late 90s as dot-com bubble, and that overshadows a lot of the interesting things that were happening globally at the time. And I started my career in tech banking, but when that blew up, I got shuffled of all places to telecom banking. And telecom had a lot of parallels to tech in its fast growth and kind of downfall, but downfall for very different reasons, not lack of fundamental businesses, but poor capital structures. How did starting your career in that space and seeing both the growth and the kind of deceleration and restructuring environment contribute to you as an investor today?
Well, I am fond of telling people that I think private equity is the last great apprenticeship because you see so many different business models. You learn from investors that have been doing this for 20, 30 years before you got into the business. And so you got to take all that in. For those of us that are 90s children. I was born in the 70s, but came of age professionally in the 90s. We've seen a number of cycles, right? And so as we're sitting here looking at a collapse in cryptocurrencies, inflation, a slowdown in global economic activity, it's good to know that I've gone through a few cycles already. While everyone sort of characterizes that era as the dot-com bust, in many ways, telecom, as you noted, had a lot of challenges. MCI WorldCom, the collapse there, while Enron was not in telecom directly, I think it suffered from a lot of the same puffery that was in the market around models that could grow into perpetuity and were never going to decelerate, and investors bought into that. Telecom in particular at the time, I think, also suffered from a big land grab. Everyone was trying to get in there and put fiber, coax, or copper, if you were doing DSL, into the ground to make sure that you sort of had that last mile and were capturing the customers. So I think in many ways, as an investor, having gone not only through the cycles, but also having seen the rise and fall of these sectors, it gives you a certain amount of trepidation in a good way as you're evaluating opportunities and not falling in love with an idea or the next fad.
Yeah. In hindsight, investing in companies that called themselves overbuilders was probably not a brilliant move.
Yes. Look, I also got some good ones wrong, right? I never thought Amazon would be what it is today. The concept of just building a bunch of warehouses and selling books, it was just something that I didn't sort of fully comprehend the vision, and I'm a lot poorer for it.
And having a DCF model with a business with 20 years of negative cash flows was a common concept. Whereas today, we see that all the time, right? People talk about businesses in terms of the ecosystem they operate without even clearly identifying a revenue model quite often. So talking about that kind of froth in the market, obviously we're seeing things come down a little bit right now. What was the catalyst and the motivation for the timing of you launch your firm, right? Officially launched in late 2021, maybe Q3 of 2021, but obviously the thought process would have started earlier than that. When did you first start thinking about setting up your own platform, and what moved you to it, especially in the middle of a pandemic or end of a pandemic or start of a pandemic, depending on your perspective on things?
Yeah, no, look, quitting a job after 16 years in the middle of a pandemic, I hope to be able to tell that story as a success story one day. But no, look, it ultimately, I think change is good. And it was time for me to move on. And when I left my last firm, I was thinking about what's the next chapter. And I was pretty flattered with some of the inbound opportunities that I saw, interviews that I had. There was the requisite conversation with a crypto fund. It's just the era we're in. But I continue to see just not only the continuation of market inefficiencies in the lower middle market, but also an ability to bring my technology background to bear. So our strategy at Ceiba is fundamentally focused on a deliberate buy and build approach. So we're screening opportunities up front with, is this a fragmented market that we can consolidate? And what ability do we have to bring technology, specifically around infrastructure tools to accelerate the growth of the business and digital marketing capabilities? Because in many ways, most businesses now have an email system. They're using computers. Many have an ERP. Those are table stakes. But once you start looking at how you're acquiring customers, how you're reaching customers, what channels you're looking to sell through, many entrepreneurs who have built successful businesses don't have a full understanding of the suite of products that are available out there to help them accelerate the business. And generally, they have just been throwing some bodies at the opportunity.
This idea of buy and build, it's been a way for a lot of private equity firms to deploy capital and try to average multiples down. But combining that with operational efficiencies and partnering with managements is something people have been kind of introducing into the playbook more recently. And when you talk about lower middle market add-ons, you're talking about often much smaller businesses.
Mhm.
How do you approach that just from a practical perspective of operations? Right? The management teams of these companies often don't have ex-bankers and M&A teams in-house. Right? How are you tackling that challenge?
Yeah, look, our approach is not on pay a lot for the first platform and dollar average down. We're really kind of looking at paying full and fair multiples, but recognizing that there is sort of a discount to comps in an inefficient market. But you hit it on the head. I mean, it comes down to people. You're valuing EBITDA, but then you're trying to figure out whether this is a team that you can back, and how will you integrate two businesses where they've never been through a merger, let alone a sponsor-led investment. And so working with them in many ways, communicating as much as you can about what this looks like, and no, we are not Mordor, because private equity is the big bad word these days. We're really here to kind of build a business up as opposed to tear it down and sell off the parts. That's the beauty of at least what we do, because we're buy and build. I mean, that's our focus. So we're looking to build great businesses.
Another thing that's evolved over the years from when I started business to now is just the cost of doing business, especially in terms of IT. Once upon a time, the setup infrastructure costs for ERP, you were talking hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. Today, with cloud computing, SaaS business models, it really brings the cost down. But as you pointed out, identifying what exists is often a challenge because there are no barriers to entry. There's any number of SaaS companies. How do you, as a private equity partner, try to figure out what are the best solutions? What's the order of solutions you implement, and how do you actually transform the culture of an organization to be, IT enabled?
Yeah, great question. And look, to a certain extent, it's in our DNA as a firm. My co-founder has a deep domain expertise in digital marketing. I come from the IT infrastructure side of the house. We have what we refer to as our tech stack. We're not coding. We just have, or try to stay on top of what are the tools that are out there. Are we looking at a business that's going to run multiple brands, and do we need a brand management platform? Is this a business that is appropriate for a NetSuite implementation, or do we need to go with an Oracle-based, or rather an SAP-based platform? And then looking at the various downstream and upstream tools to manage the business. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the cost of the tools out there has come down significantly. And for us, it's about, much like a product development company with rapid prototyping, basically rapid deployment, testing it, whether it's 90 days or 180 days, and seeing if you're getting that ROI. The good news is you don't have to make a multi-million-dollar investment in the hardware in an IT closet on-prem. You're able to test out these tools and then make the decision to keep it or move on to something else.
And similarly, even in the business of asset management, the costs of running a quality asset management shop have changed quite drastically. Right? Can you maybe talk about the timing of when you launched your firm and some of the challenges that you faced, and some of the wisdom you've gained in the last several months in the process, as maybe more people in the market with dislocation are thinking possibly about launching their own firms?
Yeah, look, in many ways, technology has enabled what we're doing. Having been at my last firm for 16 years, I was able to see what it was like to start a firm in 2005 and what was required. The pandemic, while it has presented challenges in terms of being out there sourcing opportunities, as well as meeting with investors, has also facilitated sourcing opportunities and meeting with investors, because you get to do this that we're doing today, and I'm not spending $20,000 to $40,000 out the gate in a travel budget, right? You're at least able to have some introductory meetings that way. And we were able to basically get all of our IT infrastructure in place. So we launched in mid-September, having made the decision kind of in mid-August, okay, we're going to do this. We want to build an institutional caliber organization. From an IT infrastructure, I led that deployment. We got our entire infrastructure up and running. It's entirely cloud-based and fully integrated with our operations. That includes a server, a VoIP system, as well as a CRM. And then in terms of managing the firm, we're bi-coastal, having these technology tools available for real-time communication has facilitated those. And then, look, we initially have begun with an outsourced model. So we have a compliance program with an outsourced compliance vendor. We're using your services to expand our capabilities in terms of being able to analyze deals and dig into industries. So we're looking to sort of build from there. But that has really facilitated our ability to launch effectively.
Yeah, and I tell a lot of entrepreneurs who are launching new private equity firms that when they're launching it, they're no longer just an investor, they are an operator. And I think a lot of folks miss that nuance, right? That you are the head of HR, you are the head of IT, accounting, right? And investors, the LPs, a lot of their diligence is looking at the operational qualities of a PE firm. And folks who launch a firm thinking that I can source deals and I'm really good at doing diligence are going to have a hard time raising that capital. So being able to create an institutional platform right out of the gates, I think is really critical to being able to build a real asset management business. And it's fascinating because private equity folks sit on the boards of companies and talk about best practices and how to build a sales force and how to run operations. And maybe digressing, just thinking about your qualities and skills, apart from what you developed professionally, you had mentioned you had a master's, not just as an MBA, but also in international studies, the concentration in Latin America. And I find that fascinating. I was a philosophy minor, and I always say, if I had studied just one thing, it would have been philosophy, and I was a finance accounting major. But how do you think having a kind of a liberal arts background helps being a well-rounded professional?
Well, I think it helps in any career, but specific to what we do, I hit some of the highlights on my personal bio. But I was a immigrant kid from Central America that landed in South LA, had a diverse neighborhood, ended up going to schools that were predominantly Caucasian, and then went to a school like UC Berkeley, being exposed to just about every background in the world. And then having that international outlook just because of my youth. I think it's incredibly important to what we do as lower middle market investors, because at the end of the day, building a model, that's a few hours worth of work. Although these days, with lack of practice, I probably need a few more hours to get some of that rust out. But at the end of the day, you're talking to entrepreneurs in the middle of America who have literally built businesses out of sheer will. And then you're addressing a workforce that is not concerned with what's on the cover of the Financial Times or what's happening in the Wall Street Journal, right? They're worried about their professional futures and the impact that your investment is going to have on their community. So just being able to relate on a human level with people, I think is so important. And just having all those diverse experience, I think, has lent itself to us just being very effective as investors, in particular in sourcing deals.
And talking about diversity, not just of experience, but of the individuals in your team, you are a fairly diverse firm, obviously being minority owned. How important is that to you guys? Is it something you think about consciously as you think about building your team? How is that important to the LPs that back you?
Yeah, look, I think for me, it's a personal aspiration that we build a firm that's really judging people on their skills and their ability to create value. So we're not looking to kind of have a certain percentage of anything. But Avi, I believe diversity begets diversity. The fact that I am Latino means I have an extensive Latino professional community. So when I'm looking to talk to industry experts, such as I did today on a deal that I'm looking at in business services, I was able to get put in touch with someone of a diverse background in that industry. So I think in many ways, for me, it's important because I think there's a certain obligation that I have as someone who's been given opportunities to create opportunities. But I also think it's in certain ways a unique competitive advantage to what we're doing, especially with our tech-oriented strategy. Technology firms are more and more diverse than society or our community as a whole. So being able to, go into a company and bring in those tools and be able to relate to those service providers in helping them implement the technology in portfolio companies is, again, I think a unique advantage for us.
And ESG is spoken about quite extensively in the private equity world these days, especially for the larger private equity firms. Is that something that's a subject of conversations in the lower middle market with your LPs?
Look, it definitely is, and any investor is asking those questions. I think it's funny because you can't take the position of, hey, I'm Latino, you shouldn't ask me about diversity, you shouldn't ask me about ESG, like I got this, right? We're subject to the same requirements of any other firm. We need to have the policies and we need to be able to adhere to those policies. Specific to ESG, our rubric is what we refer to as ESG plus F. Many of the businesses that we're investing in are smaller companies. There's not a lot of room for failure. And so we start with a core financial analysis and then look at those ESG goals to make sure they are accretive to the financial performance of the business. But we are definitely getting those questions from investors. And we also get questions from some founders, entrepreneurs about what our plans are for their business as well. I think it's just part of the lexicon of business now.
Switching gears a little bit, just looking at what the market is and the opportunities. You've been in this industry a really long time, obviously. The private equity model historically been one, you deploy capital in years, 1 through 3, maybe trickle into 5, and then you harvest, and then you're done with the fund by year 10. It seems increasingly J-curves are getting longer and longer. And what's your perspective on that? Are there ways you can, truncate the J-curve? Are there ways you can extend it and still have, meaningful returns and liquidity for LPs? What are you seeing there?
That's a great question. And look, I think it depends on your strategy, right? If you are a deep discount or special situations investor, then I think your realization horizon can be shorter because you're fixing a very distinct thing that needs to be addressed in the business, whether it's a bad balance sheet or some operational aspect of the business. I think to a certain extent, you've seen the hold periods extend simply because the operational value add is so critical. You can't just financially engineer your way into return anymore, especially not with the types of multiples that you're seeing, right? 10 plus million EBITDA business is trading at astronomical multiples. To really be able to realize value if you're paying that much, it's going to be because you're going to have to do something to that business, whether it's add-ons or new service lines, and that takes time to build out. So I think it's strategy specific. From our perspective, for us, I think, we generally underwrite to kind of a 4 to 5 year hold, but we also try to identify ways that we can accelerate coming through that J-curve. And for us, if you go on our website, we're very transparent on our strategy. We have sort of this image of buy and builds and where we think it can add value. Because yes, that J-curve on the initial platform is there. But if you can, again, be deliberate as you're screening opportunities and identify those add-ons, then you're quickly able to sort of grow inorganically and demonstrate some value creation out the gate. And then it just comes down to consultation with other stakeholders, including an LPAC and the board of the respective portfolio company in terms of, hey, when's the right time to look to monetize this?
Yeah, obviously finding a good deal takes a lot of energy and work. And after you make an investment, you get to know that business really well. And increasingly, I see private equity firms saying, why do I want to sell this business? Because quite often you're selling it to another private equity firm. And depending on how much value created, there might still be a lot of value to create through larger acquisitions or diversification. And seeing a lot of continuation vehicles, LPs rolling their capital into a new entity. But it's still a fairly new concept in the lower middle market. What do you think the opportunities are for continuation vehicles in your world?
So I think we're seeing more of them now, but I think ultimately investors want to see liquidity and a return. I think there's a place and a time for continuity vehicles. For smaller funds or funds focused in the lower middle market, I think the justification for that continuation vehicle for the selling LPs becomes a bit more challenging. But again, these creative financing tools and vehicles that are out there, there's a place and time for them. We're more traditional or traditionally focused and look at building it and then deploying it. And look, if we identify a market that's highly fragmented with an opportunity to continue to build out, for us, it may be more driven by concentration limits from the capital providers that we brought in originally, right? If you, and I don't yet have this Class A problem, if we had a 100 million enterprise value business and through a series of acquisitions, we now had a $300 million enterprise value business, and we could see a path to doubling that. But the investors that came in originally are tapped out for many sorts of reasons, then yeah, that is the appropriate time to look at sort of a dedicated single asset vehicle to continue to create that value, and then everyone on both sides of the equation gets a fair transaction.
Another dynamic I'm seeing a lot of in the lower middle market is increasing number of fundless sponsors, and not just fundless sponsors who are trying to establish a track record so they can go raise a fund, but folks whose strategy doesn't ever involve raising a fund, but just creating SPVs and doing single deals, right? And there's pros and cons to either model. What's your view on having SPV, fundless sponsor type of driven transactions versus being a committed capital fund?
Yeah, look, independent sponsors have become an asset class onto themselves, right? So we don't yet have a committed fund. We're going to be doing deals on a case-by-case basis until we get there. Now, the challenge is you spend so much time trying to round up the capital that I think the independent sponsor model has some value if you have a stable of capital providers that are following you. It's very hard, in my view, to execute on a strategy like ours without committed capital, because you need to have that conviction around the fragmented market and the technology implementation. And as you know from your tech banking days, anytime you're implementing technology, there are going to be the speed bumps, right? Because something happened, the data set is taking a bit longer to clean up and do. But look, I've seen some very successful individuals and firms that have decided to just stick with that independent deal-by-deal model. It has certain economic benefits, but I think those that are able to do that, again, have that cadre of investors that are following them from transaction to transaction.
Now, your crystal ball moment, what are your big predictions for the rest of the year? What are going to be the things that drive, macroeconomic dynamics that we're operating within?
Look, there's the stuff I think we can all underwrite to, right, which is continued supply chain uncertainty. I think in many ways, the challenges in the supply chain were exacerbated by COVID, have been exacerbated by the Ukrainian war or the conflict in the Ukraine. But those issues, the supply chain issues, were already there. So, it wasn't COVID. COVID just sort of accentuated the issues. And then, if like us, you're in the LBO business, you're now underwriting to a rising rate environment. And I think everyone needs to dust off their finance book and figure out how do I operate in an inflationary environment. I mean, we've been spoiled for, the last, 25 years. Yeah, we've seen normal kind of cost of living adjustments, but you've not seen what you've seen today. So I think all of us are going to, be a lot more diligent in thinking about, okay, what's the ability to pass through price increases? How do I think about cost increase absorption? And then a general inflationary macroeconomic environment. Again, I left Guatemala when I was very young, but being a child in an immigrant home, you knew about the hyperinflation that was taking place in Latin America. So it's not a concept that is foreign to me, but it's definitely a concept that is foreign to me as a professional because it's not an environment that I've had to deploy capital through or manage portfolio companies during. Again, just to recap, right? Dot-com bubble, implosion of the telecom sector, Great Recession, 9/11, housing crisis. Now we're in the environment we're in. So if you stick around long enough, you'll see it all.
Well, Gerson, thank you so much for taking the time to speak today. It's been such a privilege to be your partner. Really excited to continue going on this journey with you.
Thank you very much, and keep up all the great work, and look forward to the next 20 years working with you all.
Yeah, and a few more cycles.
Exactly. You take care.
You as well.